3 days after my boyfriend proposed, I plotted my revenge. Oh, I was crying tears of joy, staring at the beautiful ring on my finger, completely oblivious that the man I loved was actually a monster, and his proposal was just the beginning of a nightmare that would shatter my entire world. 3 days later, I was plotting how to make him pay for what he'd done. He'd proposed with this breathtaking vintage ring. Sapphires, diamonds, an intricate setting, absolutely stunning. I was a mess, happy crying, freaking out, saying yes 100 times. When I finally caught my breath, I asked where he found such a treasure. He smiled, telling me it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations from his grandmother. My heart swelled. I felt so incredibly touched that he wanted me to have something with so much history, so much meaning. That night, I posted photos on Instagram, close-ups of the ring, gushing about how lucky I was to be marrying into such a wonderful family. My friends flooded the comments with, "Congratulations!" and heart emojis. But then, Monday morning arrived, and a direct message popped up from a woman I didn't know. Her message was blunt. "That ring belonged to my grandmother. I need to know where your fiancé really got it." My first reaction was annoyance. I clicked on her profile and instantly recognized her. She was his ex-girlfriend from 5 years ago. My fiancé had mentioned her before. Jealousy, I thought. She's just trying to cause drama. I messaged her back, politely but firmly, explaining that the ring was a family heirloom, generations old, and she must be mistaken. Her response hit differently. 3 old family photos. And there it was, unmistakable, the exact same ring, on an elderly woman's hand. Her caption read, "That's my grandmother. The ring disappeared from my apartment 5 years ago, right after we broke up." She didn't stop there. She attached a police report from 5 years ago, listing stolen jewelry, with a description that matched my ring perfectly. The engraving inside the band, EMH 1952, for her great-grandmother's initials. It was all there. My stomach dropped. I felt a cold wave of sickness wash over me. I had to know. I agreed to meet her at a diner. Sitting across from her, comparing the photos to the ring on my own finger, the reality was undeniable. The beautiful symbol of our engagement was, without a doubt, stolen. She explained that the ring, along with several other pieces of jewelry, had vanished from her apartment after a bad breakup, right after my fiancé came to collect his things. She'd suspected him then but had no proof. We talked for hours. She started describing other items that had gone missing. And that's when my stomach plummeted even further. I recognized some of the descriptions. Rushing home, I tore through my own jewelry box. 3 pieces I'd always believed were real diamonds and gold suddenly looked off. Under closer inspection, they were obviously cheap fakes. He'd been stealing from me too. Systematically, replacing my genuine jewelry with costume pieces, little by little, making me think I was just misplacing things. I called her back, and for the next 2 hours, we pieced together his sickening pattern. This wasn't just about us. He'd probably done this to countless other women. A furious, icy rage began to build inside me. I wanted to go to the police immediately, but Camila, his ex, cautioned me. Without concrete proof, they might not act. And even with her 5-year-old police report, he could easily claim he found the ring or bought it. I sat there, seething, thinking about how he'd proposed with stolen property, how he'd systematically robbed me for months. Then, an idea sparked in my mind. A plan. I told Camila, "I know how we can catch him. And get everything back." Over the next 2 days, we meticulously put our trap together. I'd tell my fiancé that my wealthy aunt was coming to visit and needed a safe place to store an incredibly expensive diamond necklace for a few days. We rigged my apartment with hidden cameras. I even staged a phone call with my aunt right in front of him, talking loudly about how the necklace was worth over $50,000 and how nervous I was about keeping it. I left a fancy jewelry box, conspicuously empty for now, on my dresser, in plain sight. The next day, I told him I was going out with friends, and I'd be gone all afternoon. Camila and I sat in her car, watching the camera feed on my phone. Within an hour of me leaving, he was in my bedroom. He went straight for the dresser, his hands on that jewelry box. We had him. On camera. But we weren't calling the police yet. While he was distracted, trying to steal a fake necklace from my apartment, Camila drove across town to his storage unit. She still had a key from when they dated, and he'd never changed the lock. Inside the unit, We found them. Plastic bags, duffel bags, overflowing with jewelry. Way more than either of us ever expected. Necklaces, rings, bracelets, watches. There had to be pieces from dozens of women. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, more unbelievable stories are definitely coming. We loaded everything into her car and drove back to Camila's apartment. We spread it all out on her living room floor, documenting everything with photos, hoping to return the items to their rightful owners. I was sifting through a bag of necklaces when Camila, digging deeper into one of the duffel bags, pulled something out and went completely still. I looked over and saw her holding a driver's license and a cell phone. She turned the license towards me. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The name and face on that license belonged to a woman who had been all over the news 6 months ago. A woman who had disappeared without a trace. Magdalena Wynne. Camila and I just sat there, surrounded by all this stolen jewelry, staring at the driver's license and phone in her shaking hands. My whole body started to tremble. I had to put down the necklace I was holding because my fingers wouldn't stop shaking. Camila's face was ghost white. Neither of us said anything for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. My brain kept trying to process what we were seeing. Magdalena Wynne. The missing woman. Her belongings, found in my fiancé's storage unit. Finally, my voice came out, shaky and weird. Camila, I whispered. Should we call the police right now? She carefully set the license down, as if it might break. We need to think this through, she said, her voice barely audible. We technically broke into the storage unit. We didn't have permission. Her old key didn't make it legal. I argued that we had to call, regardless. This was about a missing person. We spent the next 20 minutes locked in a tense debate. The license sat between us on the floor, a constant, sickening reminder. Every time I looked at it, I felt nauseous. Camila worried that if we admitted to breaking in, the evidence might not count in court. I countered, I don't care about getting in trouble if it means finding out what happened to this woman. We went back and forth until Camila finally suggested calling the tip line anonymously. I shook my head, gesturing to the piles of evidence around us. We have physical proof. Her actual license and phone. An anonymous tip won't help anyone. Camila looked at the license again, then at me. Slowly, she nodded. We agreed. Doing the right thing mattered more than protecting ourselves. I picked up my phone. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice. I pulled up the non-emergency police number and pressed call. The operator answered, and I asked to speak with whoever was handling the Magdalena Wynne missing person case. She put me on hold. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out the generic soft jazz hold music that felt so wrong for the situation. Camila sat next to me, biting her thumbnail, her eyes fixed on the license and phone. Then someone picked up. A man's voice. Detective Octavius Wynne, he said. My stomach dropped. Wynne. He had to be related to her. I told him I had information about Magdalena's disappearance. His voice grew tight, controlled, as he asked what kind of information. I found her driver's license and phone, I managed. Silence stretched on the other end for what felt like an eternity. Then, he asked me to come to the station immediately. He gave me the address, told me to ask for him. Okay, I whispered and hung up. Camila was already standing, looking for plastic bags. We carefully packed Magdalena's license and phone into a Ziploc, making sure not to touch them more than we already had. Then we started loading all the stolen jewelry back into the bags. It took us almost 15 minutes. We didn't speak a word. I think we were both trying to process that this situation had just become so much more serious than recovering stolen property. The drive to the police station was surreal. Camila drove. I stared out the window, the radio off. My mind raced, replaying every interaction with my fiancé. The jewelry was one thing, but Magdalena, she disappeared. And her stuff was in his storage unit. Detective Wynne met us in the lobby. I recognized him instantly, even though I'd never seen him before. He had the same eyes as Magdalena from her news photos, the same shape to his face. He looked professional in his suit and badge, but I saw his hands clench into fists when I said we found his sister's belongings in my fiancé's storage unit. He led us down a hallway, into a small interview room with a metal table and a few chairs. Everything looked gray, Institutional. We sat down, and Detective Wynne pulled out a notebook. I started explaining everything from the very beginning. The proposal, the ring, Camila's Instagram message, the discovery that the ring was stolen, setting the trap, going to the storage unit, finding all the jewelry. He listened without interrupting, just taking notes, his jaw growing tighter and tighter with each new piece of information. When I got to the part about finding a storage unit full of jewelry from dozens of women, he finally looked up and asked how we accessed it. Camila spoke, her voice steady, admitting she still had a key from when she dated my fiancé 5 years ago. Detective Wynne wrote that down, acknowledging it complicated things legally. But then he looked up from his notebook, his eyes intense. Right now, he said, I'm more concerned with finding out what happened to my sister. Camila reached into her bag and slid the plastic bag with Magdalena's license and phone across the table to him. I watched his face as he picked it up, staring at his sister's driver's license through the plastic. His professional mask cracked. Just a little. His eyes grew wet, and his hand shook slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, then quickly stood up, excusing himself. Through the window in the door, I could see him in the hallway, taking deep, shuddering breaths, his shoulders shaking. He stood there for maybe 2 minutes, trying to pull himself back together, before returning to the room. In his eyes, I could see he was barely holding it together, but he sat back down, opened his notebook, as if we were just discussing a routine case. He asked specific questions. When had I last seen the ring? Had my fiancé ever mentioned anyone named Magdalena? Had he taken any unusual trips in the past 6 months? I answered everything as clearly as I could, Camila adding details about the storage unit, how long her key had worked. Detective Wynne wrote down every word. When we finished, he told us he needed to move fast before my fiancé realized anything was wrong. The video footage of my fiancé attempting to steal the fake necklace gave them grounds to arrest him for theft. Once he was in custody, they could question him about everything else. Detective Wynne assigned 2 officers to escort me back to my apartment. I needed to pack a bag, get my important belongings before my fiancé came home from work. He warned me not to take anything that might be evidence, especially not the engagement ring. The officers drove me to my apartment and waited in the living room while I went to my bedroom. I stood there, my hands shaking, looking at everything. All the normal, everyday things suddenly felt wrong, tainted. His coffee mug, still in the sink from that morning, with a little dried coffee at the bottom. The thought of how calm he must have been, drinking his coffee after potentially killing someone, made me sick. His jacket hung on a chair. His shoes by the door. Everything looked so ordinary, so harmless. I grabbed my laptop, unplugged the charger. My birth certificate, passport, insurance documents. All my important papers went into a file. I threw clothes into a duffel bag, not even looking at what I was grabbing, just pulling things from hangers and drawers. Phone charger, toothbrush, daily meds. The engagement ring sat on my dresser where I'd left it that morning, sapphires catching the light. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering how happy I'd been when he proposed, how I'd cried and said yes over and over. Now I knew it was stolen from Camila's grandmother, and he'd probably stolen from dozens of other women too. I decided to leave it right there. Let the police take it. I never wanted to see it again. The officers drove me back to Camila's apartment. I hauled my duffel bag up to her door. She'd already made up her couch with blankets and a pillow. We sat down, turned on the local news, but there was nothing yet about an arrest. The police were still getting everything ready. Camila ordered pizza, but when it arrived, neither of us could eat more than a few bites. We just picked at the slices, staring at our phones, waiting for Detective Wynne to call. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Around 6 o'clock that evening, my phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. My heart slammed against my ribs. Camila grabbed my arm. I forced myself to answer, tried to make my voice sound normal. He asked if I wanted to meet him for dinner at our favorite Italian place. I told him I wasn't feeling well, planning an early night. He sounded completely normal, unconcerned, asking if I needed him to pick up anything from the pharmacy. I said no, just needed to sleep. He said he loved me. I forced myself to say it back, even though the words made me want to vomit. When I hung up, Camila and I just looked at each other. He had no idea his entire world was about to explode. An hour later, Detective Wynne called. They'd arrested my fiancé at his workplace on charges of attempted theft. He was being held for questioning. Detective Wynn said he'd immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any questions. Exactly what they expected. But the arrest gave them what they needed: legal grounds to search his storage unit. That evening, the police executed a search warrant. Detective Wynn called again around 9 p.m. to confirm they'd recovered all the jewelry, plus additional evidence they were still processing. His voice sounded exhausted, but there was something grimly satisfied in his tone, like he was finally making progress after months of hitting dead ends trying to find his sister. Camila and I spent that night on her couch, a mindless reality show flickering on the TV, neither of us really watching. Every little sound from the hallway or the street made us jump. We kept checking our phones, even though Detective Wynn said he wouldn't have updates until morning. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times my fiancé had touched me, held my hand, kissed me. I kept wondering if those same hands had hurt Magdalena. Had he seemed different after she disappeared? Had I missed signs? I went over every memory from the past 6 months, desperate to figure out if I'd been blind to something obvious. The next morning, Detective Wynn called right as Camila was making coffee. He said the forensic team had analyzed Magdalena's phone overnight. The last activity: a text message exchange with someone using a burner phone. The messages indicated she was planning to meet someone she knew. The location data showed her phone went dead near a rural area outside the city. Then, a memory flashed, making my stomach clench. My fiancé had mentioned having family property in a rural area, where he used to go hunting. He'd even shown me pictures once, talking about how peaceful it was out there. When I told Detective Wynn this, his voice grew very quiet. He asked for the exact location. I pulled up my Instagram, scrolled back through old photos until I found the ones where he'd tagged the general area last year. I read Detective Wynn the location tag, and I could hear him relaying the information to someone else in the background. Within hours, the police had identified the exact property and were organizing a search team. Detective Wynn called me back to explain they were bringing in cadaver dogs and forensic specialists. He told me this part might take days, or even weeks, depending on the property's size and what they found. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath it. He was preparing himself for what they might discover. I needed to prepare myself, too. The next morning, a man named Ezekiel Houston called. He introduced himself as the prosecutor assigned to the case. His deep voice sounded tired, even though it was only 9 in the morning. He told me they were building a solid case against my fiancé for the theft charges, while the investigation into Magdalena's disappearance continued in parallel. The theft evidence was strong enough to guarantee conviction, but connecting my fiancé to what happened to Magdalena required more than just finding her belongings. They needed physical evidence, witness testimony, something concrete. I asked what that meant for the timeline. He said the theft trial could happen within 6 months, but the other investigation might take much longer. After we hung up, I felt frustrated. I wanted answers immediately, but the legal system moved slowly. Camila made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table, staring at all the jewelry we'd brought back from the storage unit. We needed to do something productive while we waited for news. I suggested we go through everything again, this time focusing on identifying owners so we could return the stolen items. Camila opened her laptop and created a spreadsheet. Columns for item description, photo, estimated value, any identifying marks. For the next 4 hours, we photographed every single piece and wrote detailed descriptions. A gold bracelet with tiny sapphires, a diamond tennis necklace with a broken clasp, a men's watch with engraved initials. Each piece represented someone who'd been stolen from, manipulated. By late afternoon, we had documented over 200 items, and my eyes hurt from staring at jewelry under Camila's desk lamp. I decided to post carefully worded messages in local community groups on social media, asking if anyone had experienced jewelry theft in the past few years. I didn't mention my fiancé by name or give too many details about the ongoing investigation. Within an hour, my inbox started filling with responses. Women describing missing engagement rings, inherited necklaces, expensive watches that vanished from their apartments. I matched descriptions to items in our spreadsheet, and felt sick as the scale of his operation became clear. He'd been doing this for years, to dozens of women across the entire city. One message stood out. A woman who said she dated my fiancé 3 years ago. She described missing jewelry, but also how his behavior changed near the end of their relationship. He became controlling, jealous, checking her phone, getting angry when she spent time with friends. Her description of how he escalated from charming to possessive made my stomach turn, because I recognized some of those patterns in my own relationship. I'd written off certain behaviors as him being protective or caring deeply about me. I forwarded all the victim responses to Detective Wynne, along with our spreadsheet matching items to owners. He called back within 20 minutes. He was assigning officers to interview each woman, document their stolen property. The investigation was expanding beyond what anyone expected. They discovered my fiancé had been systematically targeting women through dating apps for at least 7 years, creating profiles that made him seem successful, trustworthy. 2 days later, Natalia Peacock, a forensic expert, called while I was helping Camila make dinner. She told me the forensic team found my fiancé's fingerprints on Magdalena's phone in multiple places, including the screen and the back casing. He'd touched that phone enough times to leave clear prints, which he couldn't explain away, since he'd told police he never met Magdalena. This physical evidence, connecting him directly to the missing woman, strengthened the case significantly. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of relief that they had solid evidence and horror at what it meant. The next morning, Detective Wynne called, his voice hollow, strained. The search team at the rural property had found disturbed earth in a wooded area near the main house. They were bringing in excavation equipment and ground-penetrating radar. "Prepare yourself," he said. "They might find something in the next few days." I could hear in his tone that he was preparing himself for the worst possible outcome. His sister had been missing for 6 months, and now they were digging up ground on property connected to the man who stole from his girlfriend. I spent those 2 days barely sleeping, checking my phone constantly, even though Detective Wynne said he'd call as soon as they had news. Camila and I tried to watch movies, but neither of us could focus. On the 3rd day, Detective Wynne called at 6 o'clock in the morning. They had found human remains buried in the wooded area. The medical examiner needed dental records to confirm identity, but the location and circumstances pointed to Magdalena. His voice cracked slightly when he said her name. I thanked him for calling and sat on Camila's couch, staring at the wall. The reality crashed over me. I had been engaged to someone capable of murder. I started crying, even though I barely knew Magdalena, overwhelmed by the thought that she was a real person, with a family who loved her, and my fiancé took her life. Camila sat next to me, her arm around my shoulders. She was crying too. We held each other and wept, because we both realized how close we'd come to potentially being his victims. If Camila hadn't sent that Instagram message, if I hadn't agreed to meet her, if we hadn't set that trap, would I have ended up like Magdalena? The news broke nationally that evening with headlines about a serial thief arrested in connection with a missing woman's murder. My phone started exploding with calls and texts from friends and family who saw the news, who recognized my fiancé's name. Messages asking if I was okay, if the reports were true, if I needed anything. I turned off my phone. I couldn't handle explaining this to anyone yet. I couldn't find words to describe what it felt like to know I almost married a murderer. 2 days later, Detective Wynne called again, asking if Camila and I would be willing to meet with Magdalena's sister. His voice was careful when he explained that Felicia wanted to thank us in person for finding the evidence that led them to her sister. My stomach twisted. The idea of facing Magdalena's family scared me more than anything else in this whole situation. But I told him yes anyway. It felt like the right thing to do, even though every fiber of my being screamed no. Camila agreed too when I called her after hanging up with the detective. We met Felicia 3 days later at a small coffee shop near the police station. I spotted her as soon as we walked in. She looked so much like Magdalena from all the photos I'd seen on the news. The same dark hair, the same shaped face. When she stood up to greet us, I saw her eyes were red and swollen from months of crying. She hugged both of us before we even sat down, thanking us through tears. She kept saying that at least now her family could have closure, could bring Magdalena home for a proper burial. I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand across the table while she cried. Camila was crying too, and tears ran down my own face, even though I was trying to hold it together. Once she calmed down enough to talk, Felicia started telling us about Magdalena's life. She said Magdalena taught 3rd grade, loved her students more than anything. She showed us pictures on her phone of Magdalena in her classroom, kids gathered around her, reading a book. Felicia said Magdalena volunteered at animal shelters on weekends, couldn't stand the thought of dogs and cats being alone in cages. She'd been planning to adopt a rescue dog right before she disappeared. Learning these details about the real person whose life my fiancé stole made everything feel worse somehow. Magdalena wasn't just a missing woman from the news anymore. She was a teacher who read to kids, helped animals, had plans for a future that was ripped away from her. I sat there listening, feeling sick, thinking about how I'd kissed the man who killed this woman, how I'd slept next to him, made dinner with him, talked about our future together, all while he was hiding what he did. We stayed at that coffee shop for over 2 hours while Felicia shared memories and showed us more photos. When we finally left, I felt like I was carrying the weight of Magdalena's whole life with me. Detective Wynn called me the next morning, his voice flat, tired. The medical examiner confirmed the remains were definitely Magdalena's based on dental records. Then he told me the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The prosecutor was now building a murder case on top of all the theft charges. I thanked him for letting me know and sat on my bed, staring at the wall for a long time. The words, blunt force trauma, repeated in my head. I couldn't stop imagining what Magdalena's last moments must have been like. A week later, Detective Wynn called again. My fiancé's lawyer was trying to negotiate a plea deal. The lawyer wanted to argue that Magdalena's death was a tragic accident, and my fiancé panicked and hid the body instead of calling for help. Rage flooded through me when I heard that. Detective Wynn, said the prosecutor, Ezekiel Houston, refused the plea deal immediately. The evidence was strong enough for trial, and Magdalena's family deserved to see full justice served. Houston told the defense lawyer, "You don't accidentally kill someone and then steal from dozens of other women for years." The investigation kept growing bigger. An FBI agent named Conrad Ferguson joined the case. They found evidence suggesting my fiancé might have done similar crimes in other states where he lived before moving here. Ferguson called me directly, asking questions about places my fiancé mentioned visiting or living. I told him everything I could remember about the stories my fiancé told me about his life before we met. Ferguson said they were looking into missing person cases in 3 other states that matched the same pattern. Women he dated, jewelry went missing, then they disappeared within months of breaking up. 2 weeks after Magdalena's remains were found, Ezekiel Houston called me to his office for a formal deposition. I sat across his desk for 4 hours, answering questions about every detail of my relationship with my fiancé. Houston asked about our first date, how we met, what he told me about his past, whether I noticed any strange behavior or unexplained absences. The whole time I was talking, I felt like I was describing a stranger instead of someone I agreed to marry. Houston recorded everything and had me sign statements confirming what I said was true. The process felt cold and clinical, but also necessary. Camila gave her deposition the same day in a different room. When we met up afterwards in the parking lot, she looked as drained as I felt. She told me Houston asked her detailed questions about the theft from 5 years ago, and about how we set the trap. Houston warned both of us that we'd probably need to testify at trial, and that the defense would try to make us look unreliable or like we had ulterior motives. We needed to prepare ourselves for that. The evidence kept piling up. The landlord of the storage facility came forward with rental records showing my fiancé had rented that unit for 8 years and paid in cash every month. Detective Wynn told me they also got security footage from 6 months ago, showing my fiancé bringing large duffel bags to the unit right around the time Magdalena disappeared. Then, a woman who lived near the storage facility contacted the police. She remembered seeing my fiancé there late one night 6 months ago. She remembered it because he seemed upset and was carrying something heavy, wrapped in a tarp, from his car into the unit. She said she almost called the police that night, because something felt wrong, but she talked herself out of it. Now, her testimony placed him at the storage unit with what could have been Magdalena's body before he moved it to that rural property where they found her. Detective Wynn called 3 days later with news that made everything feel even more real. The forensic team found soil samples in my fiancé's car trunk that matched the exact type of soil from where they found Magdalena buried. He explained that the soil had specific mineral content and plant material that only existed in that rural area, which meant my fiancé's car had definitely been at that burial site. This wasn't just circumstantial anymore. They had physical evidence linking his vehicle directly to where he put Magdalena's body. I hung up the phone and realized I couldn't keep functioning normally while processing all of this. Camila suggested I talk to someone professional. I was barely sleeping and having panic attacks every time I thought about how close I came to marrying a murderer. She gave me the name of a therapist who worked with trauma victims. I called that afternoon and got an appointment for the next day. Sitting in Angelina's office felt strange at first. I'd never done therapy before. Angelina had this calm way of listening that made it easier to talk about everything. I told her about the proposal, the ring, discovering the theft, finding Magdalena's license, all of it. She asked me questions about how I was sleeping and eating, whether I felt safe in my daily life. I admitted I was having nightmares where my fiancé was chasing me through dark hallways, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the times we were alone together, and what he might have been capable of doing to me. Angelina explained that trauma responses were normal after discovering someone you trusted was dangerous. She helped me understand that his deception wasn't about my judgment being bad, but about how good he was at manipulation. Serial criminals spend years perfecting their ability to seem normal and trustworthy. That first session helped me realize I needed regular appointments to work through this. Meanwhile, the investigation kept expanding in ways I couldn't have imagined. Conrad Ferguson from the FBI called to tell me they'd been looking into missing person cases in states where my fiancé lived before moving here. They found 2 other women who fit the exact same pattern. Both had dated my fiancé. Both reported jewelry stolen before the relationship ended, and both disappeared within months of breaking up with him. Ferguson said they were working with local police in those states to investigate further. He asked me more questions about places my fiancé mentioned traveling to, and whether he ever talked about his past relationships. I told him everything I could remember, but it wasn't much. My fiancé always kept his past vague. A week after that conversation, Ezekiel Houston called me to his office to discuss the trial timeline. I sat across from his desk while he explained that a case this complicated would take at least 6 months to prepare properly. They had to process all the forensic evidence, interview dozens of witnesses, and build an airtight case for the murder charge. Houston said he felt confident about getting convictions on the theft charges because the evidence was overwhelming, but the murder charge required more careful preparation. The physical evidence was strong with the soil samples and fingerprints on Magdalena's phone, but they needed to establish clear motive and opportunity. He warned me that the defense would try every trick to create reasonable doubt. I asked if there was anything I could do to help, and Houston said my testimony would be crucial, along with Camila's and all the other victims we'd identified. That gave me an idea for something productive I could do while waiting for the trial. I called Camila and suggested we work with Detective Wynn to return all the stolen jewelry to the women we'd identified. We spent the next month setting up meetings with victim after victim, giving back their property and listening to their stories. Each meeting felt heavy with emotion. A woman named Jessica cried when we returned her grandmother's pearl necklace that had been stolen 3 years ago. She told us she'd dated my fiancé for 8 months and noticed expensive jewelry going missing, but he convinced her she was being paranoid and probably misplaced the items herself. Another woman, Rachel, got angry when she saw her diamond bracelet. She said my fiancé had gaslit her for months about the missing jewelry, making her feel crazy for suspecting him. Hearing their stories made me realize how calculated his whole operation was. He didn't just steal random items. He targeted specific pieces that had value but weren't so expensive that women would immediately call the police. He made them doubt themselves first. One afternoon, we met with a woman named Lauren who had a story that shook me. She told us she broke up with my fiancé 2 years ago because he became possessive and controlling near the end of their relationship. He started showing up at her workplace unannounced and getting jealous if she spent time with friends. She said she felt genuinely unsafe and worried he might hurt her, so she ended things and blocked his number. Lauren looked at me with serious eyes and said she was grateful every day that she got out when she did. Her jewelry had gone missing, but she considered that a small price to pay for escaping what she felt was a dangerous situation. Hearing her describe his behavior made me think about times when my fiancé seemed overly interested in where I was going or who I was with. I'd written it off as him being caring and attentive, but now I wondered if I'd missed warning signs. The prosecutor's office moved forward with formal charges in early fall. Ezekiel Houston called to tell me they were charging my fiancé with first-degree murder in Magdalena's death, along with multiple counts of grand theft and fraud charges related to selling stolen jewelry. The bail was set at $2 million, which meant he'd stay in custody until trial. Houston sounded satisfied when he explained that the evidence was strong enough to pursue the maximum charges. Around that same time, Felicia Wynn reached out to Camila and me with a request. Magdalena's remains had been released to the family, and they wanted to hold a proper memorial service now that they could finally lay her to rest. Felicia invited us to attend, saying our role in bringing Magdalena home meant we were part of her story. I felt nervous about going because I didn't know if I had the right to be there. But Camila convinced me that Felicia genuinely wanted us present. The memorial service was held at a small church on a Saturday afternoon. Walking into that space, filled with people who loved Magdalena, felt overwhelming. Photos of her were displayed around the room, a smiling woman with kind eyes, who looked so alive and happy. I stood in the back trying to stay invisible, but Felicia saw me and walked over. She introduced me to Magdalena's mother, a woman with the same gentle face as her daughter, but aged by months of grief. Magdalena's mother took my hands in hers and thanked me for helping bring her daughter home. She said, not knowing what happened to Magdalena was torture, and even though the truth was horrible, at least now they could have closure and say goodbye properly. I started crying and told her I felt guilty for ever being with the man who killed her daughter. She squeezed my hands tighter and said I wasn't responsible for his evil. She told me I helped give their family peace by uncovering the truth, and that took courage. Standing in that church, surrounded by Magdalena's family and friends, I felt the full weight of what my fiancé had destroyed. This wasn't just about stolen jewelry or even about one murder. He'd shattered entire families and left dozens of women traumatized. 2 days after the memorial, Conrad Ferguson called with news that made everything even worse. The FBI had confirmed that the 2 other missing women from different states were also murdered. They found evidence linking my fiancé to their deaths through the same patterns of theft and disposal methods. Ferguson's voice was grim when he told me my fiancé was likely a serial killer who'd been operating for nearly a decade. They were still investigating whether there might be even more victims they hadn't identified yet. I sat on Camila's couch after that phone call, feeling numb. The man who proposed to me with a stolen ring, who I'd planned to spend my life with, had been killing women for years. The news broke on every major channel within 24 hours of the FBI confirming my fiancé was connected to multiple murders across different states. My phone started ringing before I even woke up that morning. Reporters calling from newspapers and TV stations, asking for interviews about my relationship with a serial killer. I turned off my phone after the 15th call. I couldn't handle hearing one more person ask me what it was like to be engaged to a murderer. Camila's phone was blowing up too, and we sat in her apartment, watching the news coverage with growing horror as they showed photos of my fiancé next to pictures of Magdalena and the other victims. The reporters called me his fiancé, and showed the Instagram photos I'd posted of the engagement ring. I felt sick knowing millions of people were seeing those happy pictures while knowing what he really was. A reporter somehow got Camila's address and knocked on her door, asking for an interview. She told him to leave or she'd call the police. I knew I could never be the public face of this nightmare. I couldn't stand in front of cameras talking about how I almost married someone who killed multiple women. Every media request went straight to voicemail, and eventually, I changed my number completely just to make it stop. Ezekiel Houston called me a few days later to discuss the legal situation, his voice serious as he explained the defense was trying to get the storage unit evidence thrown out. He said the defense lawyer argued that because Camila and I broke into the unit illegally, everything we found couldn't be used in court. Panic rose in my chest. Without that evidence, the whole case could fall apart. But Ezekiel told me not to worry. He explained that the judge would probably allow the evidence anyway because of emergency circumstances, and because the police got a proper search warrant right after we reported what we found. The preliminary hearings turned into a battle between the prosecutor and defense attorney over what the jury would get to hear, with the defense trying to block every piece of evidence we discovered. Ezekiel called me after each hearing to update me, and I could hear the frustration in his voice when the defense managed to delay things with procedural arguments. The legal process moved slower than I expected, with weeks passing between hearings while lawyers argued over technical details. I had to go back to my apartment eventually to get more of my things, because I couldn't keep borrowing Camila's clothes forever. Walking through that door made my skin crawl, knowing I'd shared that space with someone who murdered people. Everything looked exactly the same as the morning he got arrested. His coffee mug still in the sink. His jacket hanging by the door. I couldn't touch anything that belonged to him without feeling disgusted. I couldn't look at our bed without thinking about all the nights I slept next to a killer. I called a moving company and hired them to pack up everything I owned and put it in a storage unit, because I knew I could never live in that apartment again. The movers came the next day, and I stood in the hallway while they boxed up my entire life, unable to step inside and watch them handle things he'd touched. When they were done, I handed my keys to the landlord and walked away without looking back. Camila helped me search for a new apartment on the other side of town, somewhere with no memories, no connection to my old life. We spent weekends looking at places until I found a small one-bedroom that felt safe and anonymous. Moving into that empty apartment felt like starting over from nothing. But at least the space was mine, untainted by what happened. I changed my phone number and deleted every social media account I had, erasing my online presence completely. Instagram, Facebook, everything went dark, because I couldn't handle seeing people's comments or having reporters track me down through old posts. I threw away photos of my fiancé and deleted every text message we'd ever exchanged, trying to erase him from my life. Even though I knew I'd never forget. Slowly, I started building a routine that felt normal. Going to work, coming home to my safe apartment where nothing reminded me of him. Camila came over most evenings, and we'd have dinner together. Not talking about the case unless there was news. Just being two people trying to move forward. 8 months after they found Magdalena's remains, the trial finally began. And I had to go to the courthouse to face my former fiancé for the first time since his arrest. I sat in the witness waiting room with Camila while the jury was selected, both of us too nervous to talk much. When they called me into the courtroom, I walked through those doors and saw him. He was sitting at the defense table in a suit, looking smaller somehow, without the charm and confidence he used to have. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt nothing but disgust. No trace of the love I thought I felt when he proposed. He looked away first, and I took my seat in the gallery, watching as the prosecutor and defense attorney gave their opening statements. Ezekiel Houston laid out the case methodically, explaining how my fiancé had targeted women for years through dating relationships, stealing from them, and eventually killing at least 3 of them. The defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that my fiancé was innocent, but his words sounded hollow against the weight of what Ezekiel presented. When they called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my hands shaking, swore to tell the truth, and sat down facing the courtroom. Ezekiel asked me to describe my relationship with the defendant, and I explained how we met and dated for 2 years before he proposed with the stolen ring. I testified about finding the fake jewelry in my box and realizing he'd been replacing my real pieces with costume jewelry. I described setting up the trap with Camila and discovering the storage unit full of stolen items from dozens of women. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination and immediately tried to paint me as a woman scorned, asking if I was angry about the breakup and making up stories for revenge. I looked right at him and said, "We never broke up because he got arrested before I could confront him about the theft." He asked if I'd ever seen my fiancé act violently, and I had to admit I hadn't, which seemed to satisfy him. But then Ezekiel stood up for redirect and asked me to describe the camping trip my fiancé took last spring, right around when Magdalena disappeared. I explained how he'd gone alone for 4 days to some family property. The jury took notes while I spoke, and I could see some of them looking at my former fiancé with disgust. Camila testified after me, describing how her grandmother's ring disappeared 5 years ago after she broke up with the defendant. She explained the police report she filed and how she recognized the ring in my Instagram photos. She walked the jury through our plan to catch him stealing and how we found the storage unit full of jewelry. The defense attorney tried to discredit her by pointing out she'd broken into the storage unit illegally. But Camila stayed calm and said she was trying to recover her grandmother's stolen property. Detective Wynn took the stand next and testified about the investigation into his sister Magdalena's disappearance. His voice stayed professional, but I could see the pain in his eyes as he described finding her remains on the defendant's family property. He explained the evidence linking my fiancé to the murder, including fingerprints on Magdalena's phone and soil samples from the defendant's car matching the burial site. The forensic evidence came next, and it was overwhelming in its thoroughness and detail. Natalia Peacock testified about finding my fiancé's fingerprints on Magdalena's phone case. Prints that couldn't be explained away since he claimed never to have met her. The soil expert explained how samples from the defendant's car trunk matched the specific composition of dirt from the burial site, including rare minerals found only in that area. Security footage from the storage facility showed the defendant bringing large duffel bags to his unit around the time Magdalena disappeared. Bags that matched the ones we found filled with stolen jewelry. Multiple women testified about jewelry disappearing after dating the defendant, establishing a clear pattern of theft through romantic relationships spanning almost a decade. The defense attorney tried to create doubt by questioning the timeline and suggesting other explanations, but every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. His forensic expert couldn't explain away the fingerprints or soil samples, and his character witnesses couldn't overcome the testimony from dozens of victims describing identical experiences. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury for deliberation. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Camila and Felicia Wynne, waiting for word, unable to eat or focus on anything except what was happening upstairs. 6 hours later, we got called back to the courtroom because the jury had reached a verdict. I took my seat and watched the jury file in, trying to read their faces for some hint of what they'd decided. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. He read, "Guilty on first-degree murder for Magdalena's death. Guilty on all theft charges. Guilty on fraud charges for selling stolen jewelry." My fiancé sat completely still as each guilty verdict was read, showing no emotion at all, like he was listening to someone else's trial. But when I looked over at Felicia, she'd collapsed forward in her seat, crying with relief that her sister's killer would finally be held accountable. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later and dismissed the jury, and I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I could finally breathe. The sentencing hearing was shorter and more formal than the trial. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before he imposed sentence, and Felicia stood up to speak about her sister. She described Magdalena as a kind person who loved teaching and helping others, and said her family had suffered for months not knowing what happened. She looked directly at my former fiancé and told him he'd stolen not just her sister's life, but her family's peace and sense of safety in the world. I watched him as she spoke, and his face remained blank. No sign of remorse or emotion. The judge then imposed sentence: life in prison without possibility of parole for Magdalena's murder, plus additional sentences for each theft and fraud conviction to run one after another. He said the defendant had shown a pattern of predatory behavior, targeting vulnerable women, and deserved the maximum punishment under law. As the bailiffs led my former fiancé out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned and looked at me one final time. I stared back at him, searching for some trace of the person I thought I knew. But all I saw in his eyes was emptiness. Like there was nothing human left inside him at all. 2 days after the sentencing, Felicia, Camila, and I met at a small coffee shop on the edge of town where nobody would recognize us or interrupt. We sat at a corner table by the window, and for the first few minutes, none of us knew what to say. The trial was over, but the weight of everything that happened still pressed down on all of us. Felicia ordered tea and wrapped her hands around the cup like she was trying to warm herself, even though it was summer outside. Camila suggested we should do something with what we'd learned, something that might help other women avoid what happened to Magdalena and all the other victims. I pulled out my phone and started taking notes as we talked through ideas for a foundation that could teach women the warning signs of predatory behavior in relationships and provide resources for reporting theft. Felicia said her family wanted to contribute money to get it started. And Camila offered to handle the legal paperwork since she had connections through her job. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop mapping out plans, filling napkins with notes about awareness campaigns and support networks. When we finally left, I felt like we were taking something truly horrible and turning it into something that might actually protect people. A year after that awful discovery in the storage unit, I'm living in a different apartment across town, slowly building a life that feels safe again. Camila comes over every Sunday for coffee, and we've become real friends instead of just two women connected by trauma. I still see Angelina every week for therapy, and she says I'm making good progress, even though I probably need to keep coming for a long time. The nightmares about my ex-fiancé don't happen every night anymore. Maybe twice a week now, instead of constantly. I changed my phone number and deleted all my social media accounts, starting fresh with new everything. The foundation Felicia, Camila, and I created launched 6 months ago, and we've already helped dozens of women recognize dangerous patterns in their relationships. I still can't believe how close I came to marrying someone capable of murder, how I lived with him and loved him without seeing what he really was. But I'm grateful every single day that Camila sent that Instagram message about her grandmother's ring, because without her reaching out, I might have married him and ended up like Magdalena. I'm learning to trust my judgment again, to feel safe in my own apartment, and to believe that not everyone is hiding something terrible. The work continues, and the healing continues. What about you? Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that you dismissed, only to find out later it was right? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.